Is hope how dopamine feels? A couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, I read the stuff or listened to the stuff of Thought by Steven Pinker. Language as a window into human nature, which opened up my mind to this area where language seems to a certain extent, reflect human nature, maybe. Now, part of this is, and part of basically the thoughts I had then based on this, was that I began to see how metaphors, for example, would reflect actual mental states in me, but also maybe in others, and how they could reflect this. Of course, I am not really seeing this, I am just thinking that this might be a link that is there. One of these results also, but maybe also observations, or I started to ask the question, what dopamine actually feels like, and to which extent dopamine, and also maybe other hormones, and also other states maybe also, might be reflected first of all into in language, and also how this kind of backplays and how there is a link between those. I also began to ask myself, how do I feel if I'm maybe more reliant on dopamine? How do I feel if I'm sleep deprived? How do I feel if I probably have more serotonin flowing in me? How do I feel if I'm less on carbs? How do I feel if I have more average carbs? And so on and so forth. Now, part of this was also to begin to sample the situations in which I probably had higher amounts of dopamine, or at least I was more exposed to kind of a dopaminergic state, if one is including the absolute amount of dopamine, and also the receptor, and also receptor sensitivity, and also if the receptors happen to not be blocked by something else, and so on and so forth. So the question then I asked is, at least a couple of days ago, is hope actually dopamine? Is hope, the word itself, the reflection of the state of dopamine we have, so basically at any point in time one could describe the state in which one is in. Of course, this absolute state doesn't really exist, one could also argue, because it is only a marginally small, an infinitely small slice of time that doesn't actually exist, because time always moves forward. But the closer we slice out the time, and we slice out the time, and then we zoom in, slice out time and zoom in, we could do this infinitely. But nonetheless, if we just say, okay, there is a cut, and even though the cut might not make sense, at least in terms of this, what I just explained, nonetheless, we could just say at a certain state, at a certain time, we have a certain state. This could be the state of mind. This could be that I have, for example, a certain set of things that I own. This could be that a tree has a certain amount of leaves at a certain point in time. So at a certain point in time, we can ascribe a state to something. And this simplification allows us then to compare states, for example, to each other. Now, if we then take dopamine and what it probably feels like, and what it might feel like to run on, and now I also have to mention that part of what I am at least describing is based on the Huberman Lab podcast, in which I learned a lot about dopamine, and I also do realize that the previous sentence I began now doesn't make sense any longer, or is just too long to be able to be continued. Now, so I did listen to a little bit of Huberman here and there. I listened to all episodes up until recently, a couple of months ago. Now, I don't want to misrepresent any of the things he mentioned in there, but at the same time, I also want to ascribe this as a source, basically, or use this as a source. Not use this as a source, but mention it as a source, basically. Well, I give credit to Andrew Huberman for making these videos, and also for me then being able to learn from them. Now, it seems to be the case that hope is not exactly dopamine, at least as of if I judge this right now. Hope seems to be, at least with the association I have with hope, and I also have this theory, which also might be just copy-pasted by someone else, but I can't remember from where it was copy-pasted, that every word just is basically, if I think about a word, then it is the accumulation of all the associations I have with this word. So a word for me could have a different meaning compared to somebody else, because obviously the associations are not identical. So words, basically the normal meaning of a word is just maybe the averaged out meaning of all of the, and normal and average in this case being kind of similar, of basically the speaking population, but not only the speaking population, one could also argue, but also the written literature in this language. And so maybe that's the average use of the word, of however it is currently still in rotation, one could say. So hope, in at least my definition of the word, which is based on probably all the contexts that have been presented to me, and therefore like similar to a machine learning algorithm, to a neural net, my neural net also learned these association and learned to tease out the different links, and eventually result in something that is then my association with the word hope and the meaning I use, or that my mind has ascribed to this. And I would say hope is less of, okay, it is just dopamine, or what dopamine feels like, but it is more that there are additionally circumstances that are quite negative, and hope being not necessarily dopamine, but kind of dopamine, the feeling of dopamine of, okay, I could now change this, I now could have a better future, the anticipation of a better future, but despite the circumstances that are present now. So one could say that hope, or I would say that hope is not specifically, even though I have no expert opinion or something like this on this, but I thought it was an interesting idea at least. So hope, not necessarily just the feeling of dopamine, but the feeling of dopamine, the anticipation maybe of a better future, despite currently the outlook actually being negative. So hope as kind of a model of the future that is based on an extrapolation of current trends, but not necessarily in a neutral way, but in a slightly more optimal way that rational calculation would account for.